The man from the bank said it like he was explaining something to a child, that, which is how most people in Colton County had started talking to me since the funeral. 43 acres of prime grazing land, Miss Kavanaugh, and you want to put rabbits on it. He said it the way someone might say you wanted to stock a lake with goldfish. He didn't look up from the paperwork when he said it. That was the part that stayed with me, the not looking. He'd already decided I wasn't worth eye contact. It was the 12th of March, a Thursday, and the heating vent behind his desk was blowing warm air that smelled like the dust you get in buildings nobody opens the windows in. Outside, it was doing that thing March does in western Kansas, where it can't decide between snow and rain, and everything on Main Street looked gray and finished in, like God had started the town and lost interest halfway through. My grandfather's farm sat 11 miles north of that bank, past the co-op at Meridian, past the old Bledsoe place that had been sold to a L out of Wichita, and sat empty now, its machine shed slowly falling in on itself. 72 acres, not 43, but the banker knew that already because it said so in the paperwork they all wanted me to sign, the paperwork that would sell it. I hadn't come in to sell it. I'd come in to talk about an operating loan, the kind my grandfather had carried for 40 years at the same institution, the same desk, maybe the same chair. He hadn't needed much. He'd told me that once sitting on the porch with a cup of black coffee and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the bank knows me, Rosie. They know I pay what I owe. He'd said it with a kind of quiet pride that I understood differently now than I had at 14. The man from the bank, his name was Garth, I think, or something like it, finally looked up. "I'll tell you what I told your aunt when she called me last month," he said. "You finish your degree. You let your uncle handle the real estate, and you'll walk away from this with money in your account instead of a foreclosure notice by November." He slid a card across the desk. It had a phone number for a realty company on it. One of those signs in the window, land buyers. We pay cash. I took the card. I put it in my coat pocket. I stood up and my grandfather's barn coat was heavy on my shoulders, and it smelled like his pipe tobacco and the wood shavings he used to keep under the workbench. And I thought about the empty hog barn on the north side of the property and the stack of wire hutches in the loft that nobody had touched since 1987. I said, "Thank you, Mr. Garth." He didn't correct me on the name. The drive back to the farm took 23 minutes. I know because I watched the odometer on my aunt's old Civic, the one she'd let me borrow for the semester. Its back seat still holding the smell of the dog she put down in March. County Road 14 runs through Hallam Township, past the Lutheran church, with the steeple that leans 2 inches off true, past the empty lot where Kowalski's Hardware used to be, past the grain elevator that hasn't turned in 6 years. I knew every mile of it the way you know a song you've heard since before you could talk. The farm sat at the end of a 1/4-mile gravel lane, the house facing east, so the morning light came through the kitchen window the way my grandfather liked it. He'd told me that once, when I was 8 or 9, sitting on that same kitchen counter while he made fried eggs. "The light comes first," he said. "You get up with it, not after it." I hadn't thought about that in 4 years. I parked in the usual spot, the gravel still cold from the March morning, and I sat for a minute with the engine ticking. The hog barn was visible from where I sat, the big red building on the north side, its roof sagging on the east end, where the storm 2 winters ago had torn a hole nobody'd bothered to patch. Garth was right about one thing. The place needed money. But he was wrong about what that meant. I went inside first. The house was exactly as he'd left it. His reading glasses on the kitchen table, a newspaper from October still folded beside his chair, a coffee ring on the counter that my aunt had stopped trying to clean. I walked through the rooms slowly. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was listening. On the second floor, in the narrow closet off the master bedroom, behind a row of my grandmother's coats that nobody had moved since she died, in 2001, I found the trunk. It was a footlocker, green painted metal, latched but not locked, the name Elmer J. Brandt was stenciled on the side. In white letters, the paint faded but legible. I knew that trunk. As a kid, I'd tried to open it a dozen times and been told it was locked. I'd been 14 when I last asked. It wasn't locked now. Inside were papers, photographs, and a leather journal with a brass clasp. I sat on the floor of the closet, with the coats pressed against me, and opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was my grandfather's, cramped and precise, the way he wrote everything, and the date at the top was January 3, 1958. He would have been 26 years old. The first entry was short. It described the price of feed in the county that week, the name of a man he'd bought breeding stock from in Cedar Rapids, and the number of offspring in a litter born the night before. I turned the page. The next entry was February, then March, then weekly entries through the spring and summer of that year. And I understood what I was holding, not a diary, a ledger, not of money, but of animals, their births, their weights, their temperaments, the ones he'd kept and the ones he'd sold, and the ones that hadn't made it through the winter. 66 years of records, written in a hand that slowed but never stopped. Even after his hands began to shake and his eyes went bad enough for the strong glasses. At the bottom of the last entry I could read clearly, dated September 12, 2022, 11 days before the stroke. He'd written, M has the touch. Keep the barns. I sat on that closet floor until the light through the east window went orange, and I thought about the wire hutches in the loft, and the man at the feed store in town who I knew from school. His son was in my graduating class, and the way my grandfather had always said, the animals tell you what they need. If you're paying attention, I hadn't been paying attention. I thought I hadn't anyway, but I was now. She didn't sleep much that night. I don't mean I lay awake worrying. I mean I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a flashlight reading entries from years I hadn't lived through. 1958, March 7th. Sow-nosed doe delivered 4, kept 2, sold 2, to the Garrett boy at the edge of town. Good weight on them by weaning. That was the same barn, the same loft, the same wire hutches, 66 years before I climbed up there and saw them empty. I turned pages until the entries got harder to make out. The handwriting stayed neat, but the letters grew smaller. A man fighting to fit his observations into the space the previous entries had claimed. By the time the rooster on the Mellet place started up, which was exactly 5:17 every morning, according to a note I'd found pinned inside the back cover of the ledger. I had a plan. Not a good one, not a complete one, but a plan. The feed store was called Fenwick and Sons, which was a joke in our town because the only sons were twins named Derek and Trevor, who were 34 and had never once agreed on anything, including which of them the sons referred to. Their father, Dale Fenwick, had run it since 1987 and still came in at 6 every morning, even though he technically retired in 2015. He was the one who knew everything about feed prices, about which farms were struggling, about which equipment was worth what on the resale market. He'd known my grandfather for 35 years. He had been the first person to tell my mother, when she came home after the funeral, that the farm was too much work for a woman her age, and that she should sell before the taxes ate her alive. He'd said it kindly. That was the worst part. I went in on a Tuesday, the 14th of March, and Derek was behind the counter. He looked at me the way most people in this town looked at me, not with cruelty, just with the particular blankness people reserve for those they haven't decided how to categorize yet. I bought a 50-pound bag of alfalfa pellets and a bottle of copper sulfate solution for the hutches, and I set the ledger on the counter next to the register and said, "I need to restock the rabbit operation." Derek looked at the ledger, then at me, then back at the ledger. "Your grandfather's rabbits," he said. "Yes, those were show-quality New Zealands. Took him 30 years to build that line." I know. He studied my face for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he rang up the alfalfa and the copper sulfate and said, "You want a breeding pair, or just the one?" I told him I'd start with 6 does and $2, and I watched the exact expression on his face, the micro-hesitation, the flicker of something that might have been respect or might have been pity. And I understood that this was the line in the sand, the place where the town would decide whether I was a girl playing farmer or whether I was something else. He wrote up the order on a carbon receipt pad, the old kind with the blue paper underneath, and he slid it across the counter, and I signed it. My signature looked nothing like my grandfather's, but I was standing in the same space he had stood in, using the same kind of paper, buying the same kind of animal. And that felt like enough for the moment. The rabbits came on the 21st of March, a Thursday, in 2 large wire cages, set inside a wooden crate in the bed of my grandfather's old Chevy. The farm equipment dealer in Colfax, a man named Paul Grady, who I'd never met, had delivered them on his way back from a run to the auction in Carthage. He helped me carry the cages to the loft, one at a time, and set them on the steel shelves my grandfather had built into the north wall. And as he was leaving, he said, "Your grandfather would have liked seeing this," which was the kindest thing anyone had said to me since the funeral, and also the thing that made me cry for the first time since I'd found the ledger. I stood in the loft with 6 does and $2 and the smell of pine shavings and alfalfa, and I read the ledger by the light of my phone, matching the breeds and the bloodlines to the animals in front of me, and I thought, all right, I'm paying attention now. The first 3 weeks were mostly smell. I don't say that to be funny. I'm being precise. Rabbit urine has an ammonia sharpness that gets into your clothes, your hair, your fingernails, and even after you scrub it out, it lives somewhere in the back of your sinuses for days. I opened every window in the farmhouse that would open, which was most of them, and I washed my hands so many times the skin on my knuckles split. My grandmother's old aprons hung on a hook by the back door, the same aprons I remembered her wearing. When I was small enough to sit on the counter and watch her shell peas. And I started wearing one of them because it had deep pockets for my phone and my notebook and the small pen I used to track feeding times. I fed them twice a day, once at 6 in the morning and again at 5:30 in the evening, and I kept the ledger open on the shelf next to the water crocks so I could mark each feeding and note anything odd. A doe not eating, a buck acting restless, the color of a dropping. My grandfather's handwriting in the margins helped me more than I expected. He'd written things like, "Choose less when she's pregnant," and "This line throws big litters, but small bodies. Good for friars, not for show," and I read those notes the way you read a letter from someone who knew they'd run out of time. He was teaching me after he was gone, the way you sometimes do with people you love. Word got around Harlow faster than I expected, which shouldn't have surprised me. The diner is 3 blocks long and everybody talks to everybody. And by the end of March, I'd heard 3 different versions of what I was doing up in that loft. One had me breeding rabbits for some kind of export business to China. Another had my uncle in California backing me with capital I didn't have. The third, which I heard from Del Faris himself at the co-op when I went in for feed, was that I was raising them as a tax write-off and would lose interest by April. I didn't argue with any of it. I just loaded the bags of alfalfa and Timothy into the back of the truck, wrote the check from the account my grandfather had set up, and drove home. What kept me steady was the work itself, the weight of the feed bag, the way the does started to recognize my footsteps on the wooden ladder, the small miracle of the first nest box I filled with straw and the doe who climbed into it without prompting and began pulling fur from her dewlap. She did it on April 9th, a Tuesday, while I was sitting on an overturned crate reading my own notebook instead of hers. And when I saw the fur coming out in clumps, I set the notebook down and watched her for a long time without moving. I was learning the rhythms. They were not the rhythms of cattle, which are the rhythms people in Harlow respected, but they were real rhythms, specific and demanding, and they belonged to this place the same way the barn and the fields and the farmhouse belonged to it, and the does were due to kindle in another week. The week between the nest building and the kindling was the longest stretch of days I can remember, not because anything dramatic happened, the opposite. The hay needed turning in the upper field, so I turned it with the old pitchfork my grandfather had hung on the barn's east wall, the one with the wooden handle worn smooth by decades of grip. The handle had his initials carved into it just below the ferrule, HLM, Harold Louis Margetti, and I found myself running my thumb over the letters every time I set the fork down. I stopped noticing I was doing it by the 3rd day. Marty stopped by on Thursday. He pulled into the drive in his same beige Ford, parked in the same spot near the mailbox, and stood with his arms crossed looking at the barn the way a man looks at something he expects to collapse. He didn't ask about the rabbits. He asked about the hay, and whether I'd gotten a second cutting in last August, and whether the well pump was still working the way it had when Harold was alive. I answered everything. When he finally got around to asking how the rabbits were doing, I said they were fine, and he nodded. Like I'd said something he already knew is true, but didn't want to believe. "They're due any day," I said before he could leave. "Well," he said. He didn't finish the sentence. He got in his truck and drove back down the lane, and I watched the dust settle behind him. And then I went back to the barn. The first doe kindled on Saturday, April 13th. I knew the signs by then. The restlessness, the pulling of fur that had already happened once but which she repeated with more urgency. The way she paced the cage and then settled, stretched out, her sides moving in a slow rhythm. I had prepared the nest boxes with straw cut from the upper field, the same straw I'd turned in the sun for 3 days. And when I slid the box into place, she turned once, sniffed the opening, and climbed in. I stood there in the aisle of the barn, with the smell of hay and wood shavings and the faint mineral scent of the well water, and I watched her settle. She kindled at 6:47 in the evening. I know because I looked at the clock on my phone when I heard the first faint sound. Not a cry, not yet, just a small wet shifting inside the box. I didn't open it. I knew enough by then to know that disturbing a nest in the first hours was a mistake. I left her in the quiet of the barn, checked the waterer, made sure the feed was level in the hopper. And then I went to the house and ate beans from a can standing at the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the barn in the last light. 11 kits. She had 11 kits, and she was a first-time mother, and she had done it in a nest she'd built herself, from straw and her own fur, in a box I'd placed in a cage in a barn that everyone in Harlow said I would sell by Christmas. And I stood in the barn aisle the next morning and counted them again to be sure. 11. Each one the size of a thumb, hairless, eyes closed, squirming toward the warmth of the huddle at the bottom of the box. By the 3rd day, 2 had not made it. I found them at the edge of the nest, pushed away from the warmth, still and cooling. The mother sat in the corner of the cage, watching me with one eye the way she always did, not aggressive, just alert, as if she understood that I was the reason the box was there, and the reason the water stayed full, and the reason the barn door was open in the morning and closed at night. I buried them beside the barn under the silver maple, the same tree I would later use as a marker for everything I buried that first year. 3 chicks, a lamb I named Clementine who died in February, the 2 kits. I dug the holes with a spade that had been my grandfather's, the handle worn smooth, the D grip at the top almost polished to the color of honey from years of hands gripping it. I did not cry. I had made a decision early that grief and farm work did not share the same hours. You could feel one and do the other, and neither would cancel the other out. So you did them in the order that kept the animals alive. 9 kits, that was enough. 3 weeks later, they were out of the nest, poking their noses through the wire of the growing cage I'd moved them into, testing the world, with the deliberate caution of anything very small in a large space. I fed them pellet crumbles from a mason jar I kept on a shelf above the cage. The same crumbles I'd used for the mother, only now there were 10 mouths instead of 1. The mother had already been bred again, a buck from Martin Kellerman's rabbitry in Cresco, 3 miles north, a New Zealand white with a calm temperament and good litter size in his pedigree. Martin had looked at me the way most people in Harlow looked at me when I first came to the co-op, which is to say he'd looked past me to the counter, waiting for the man who was presumably going to ask the question. I asked the question anyway. He told me the buck's birth date, March 14 of the previous year, and the size of his last litter, 11, and the price, $15, which I paid in cash from the envelope I kept in the glove box of the truck, because I had learned not to keep large amounts of cash in the house. By June, the original 9 were weaned and sorted, 4 does and 5 bucks, and the mother was already bred again with a second litter visible in her belly, by the way she walked, slower, wider, the way a woman walks when she is carrying something that is not yet ready to be carried, but is already heavy enough to know it is there. The barn smelled of hay and ammonium nitrate, and the particular sweet musk of rabbit, which is not an unpleasant smell if you are used to it, which I was by then, which meant that when I walked into the co-op in Cresco on a Tuesday afternoon in late June and stood behind 3 men buying fencing supplies, the clerk, a woman named Pauline, middle-aged with reading glasses on a beaded chain, sniffed once and said simply, "Rabbit person." She said it the way someone might say cattle person or hog person, with a respect that was not warmth but was not dismissal either, which in Harlow was as close to an accolade as I had any right to expect. I bought 3 bags of layer feed and a 50-foot roll of hardware cloth with the small hexagonal mesh that was right for weanlings, and I drove the 11 miles back to the farm with the windows down because the truck's AC had stopped working in May, and I had not yet prioritized the $200 it would cost to fix it. The rabbits did not care about the AC. The rabbits cared about the feed and the water and the temperature of the barn, which I was learning to manage with tarps and fans and the strategic opening and closing of windows according to which way the wind was coming from. And they cared about being checked once in the morning and once at dusk, which is what I did every day, including the days it rained so hard. I walked the 50 yards between house and barn with my coat over my head like a hood and my boots filicking with water and the dogs standing at the back door looking at me with the expression dogs wear when they believe a person is making poor choices. By the 3rd week of July, I had lost 2 does to heat stress despite the tarps and the fans, and I buried them behind the machine shed where the ground was soft enough to turn with a spade. I told myself it was normal. The neighbor 3 farms over, Del Foss, who ran a cattle operation on 200 acres and who had looked at me the way men look at children, playing dress-up when I moved in, had told me in May that rabbits were delicate and that anyone could lose a few. He said it like a warning. I took it as permission to grieve quietly and move on. The nest boxes arrived on a Tuesday in late July, ordered from a supplier in Ohio, whose catalog I had studied until the pages were soft with use. I had 12 nesting cages set up in the cooler corner of the barn, each one lined with straw I had baled myself from the south field, with the old case baler that wheezed and clattered, but still functioned if you fed the hay in at the right angle. Loading the baler onto the trailer by herself took her 40 minutes and 2 pieces of scrap lumber, used as chocks to keep the wheels from rolling. But she did it. She told no one about it because the telling would have taken longer than the doing, and because she had learned by then that accomplishments narrated to the wrong audience became arguments, and she had no patience left for arguments. The first litter came on the 14th of August, a Wednesday, which she remembered because the 14th was her mother's birthday. 7 kits, pink and hairless, curled in the nest of straw, like something out of a textbook she had ordered, used from a college bookstore in December. She sat on the overturned crate she kept in the barn for exactly that purpose, and watched the doe pull fur from her dewlap to cover them, and she did not cry, but she felt something shift in her chest that she would later recognize as the first moment she believed this might actually work. She reported the litter to the county extension office on the form they provided online. Number of live births, number of losses, weights at weaning. The woman on the phone, Carolyn, who had been doing this job for 22 years and who had never once made her feel young for her age, took the information and said it sounded like a good, strong litter for a young operation, and that was all. It was enough. By October, she had 31 breeding does and 4 bucks, and the barn smelled different now. Warm and alive in a way it hadn't since her grandfather kept the dairy herd. The kind of smell that meant the building was being used the way it was meant to be used. The grow-out pens along the north wall held 63 kits at various stages, and every Sunday she moved them to the next pen, cleaned the previous ones, and documented the weight gain in the leather notebook she had taken from the drawer in her grandfather's study. She had written his name on the first page, in her own handwriting now, a bridge between the 2 lists that lived inside that cover. August to October was 8 weeks, which was how long it took to get a rabbit from birth to market weight if you knew what you were doing. And she knew what she was doing. Not from books, not entirely, though the books helped. Mostly from the animals themselves, from watching the does who were good mothers and the ones who weren't, from learning which bucks to keep for breeding and which to cull early before they cost her feed money she didn't have. The state processing plant in Harlan held its licensing for rabbit inspection in late October, and she drove there on a Thursday in her grandfather's truck with the 37th bottle of apple cider in the passenger seat, not because anyone had asked for it, but because her grandmother used to bring something every time she went anywhere, and it had become her own habit without her deciding to adopt it. The inspector was a man named Dale, who was missing the tip of his left ring finger, and who looked at her driver's license, and then at the processing room, and then back at her license, and she had stopped being surprised by that sequence. He walked the room with her for 40 minutes, running his hands along the stainless steel tables, checking the overhead rails, the walk-in cooler, the stunner equipment. He asked her about her kill floor setup and she answered him directly because there was nothing to hide in a room she had built herself, slowly, with lumber from the co-op in Mason City and hardware from Menards, and advice from a YouTube video made by a rabbit farmer in Pennsylvania who kept saying yins instead of y'all. Dale approved her facility on the spot, signed the form, shook her hand with his incomplete one, and told her to keep good records. She had been keeping good records since March. The records were the only thing standing between her and the people who wanted her to fail, and she intended to keep them that way. The first commercial order came the first week of November, and it was not a restaurant. It was a specialty grocery chain that served the Quad Cities, 8 locations across eastern Iowa and western Illinois, and they wanted fresh rabbit, whole and frozen, 12 heads per week to start, with the possibility of scaling to 30 if the product moved. She read the email 3 times sitting at her grandfather's desk in the kitchen, where the wood was worn smooth under his old reading lamp, and she felt the same thing she had felt in August watching the first litter, a shift in the chest, a kind of settling, and this time she let herself believe it. She printed the email. She'd been printing every inquiry, every reply, every order and refusal, since August, filing them in the 3-ring binder her grandfather had labeled Tax Records 1978-1994, until she unstuck the spine and replaced the contents with her own pages. That felt right. She called the processor in Thompson on Wednesday, confirmed their capacity, and drove out Friday with the first 12 dressed and ice-packed in labeled totes. They weighed the product on a stainless steel scale, noted the yield, and cut her a check that wasn't large but wasn't small either, enough to cover the feed bill and leave $400 on the table. She drove home with the empty totes, rattling in the bed of the truck and the window down in 38-degree air, and she thought about her grandfather driving these same roads with the same windows down. He'd told her once the only business advice worth anything: deliver exactly what you promised, a little early if you can, and never let them see you sweat. She hadn't been sweating. She was too tired for that. The chain's buyer emailed the next Monday, asking about the scaling timeline. She sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open and the 3-ring binder open beside it, her coffee going cold the way it always did when she got focused on something. The buyer's email was professional and brief. They wanted to know if she could deliver 300 units per week by March 1st, and if not, what her honest timeline looked like. 300. She pulled up her breeding records, the calendar she kept taped inside the binder's front cover with its color-coded squares, and did the math twice. She'd need another colony set up, a second processor visit per week, and either a walk-in cooler or a standing arrangement at the Thompson facility. She typed back that she'd have a full proposal by Thursday. The buyer replied within the hour Thursday worked. She closed the laptop and looked at the back door, at the mudroom beyond it, at the concrete floor that needed sealing and the wall where she could hang the second colony unit. The math worked barely. That was how she liked it. By April, she had the second colony running. By June, she signed the lease on the Thompson cooler. The concrete in the mudroom stayed bare. She decided she liked it that way The floor solid underfoot, the wall waiting. Granddad's barn coat still hung on the hook by the back door, and she still reached for it some mornings when the air had that particular early chill. She wasn't wearing it for luck. She wore it because it fit the way a thing fits when it was meant for you, even if nobody else could see it. Some of you know exactly what I mean. You know the weight of a binder left behind, the pressure of a phone call nobody expected, the satisfaction of proving the math when everyone else called it impossible. If you've got your own story, your grandfather's tool, your grandmother's ledger, something nobody else believed in but you, I'd love to hear it. Leave it in the comments. There's usually someone reading who need to know they're not alone in it.